What would you do if the one thing left to you wasn't Moneyland or a second chance, but a place that had been waiting for the wrong man to leave and the right one to arrive? When a lone cowboy inherits a forgotten island once owned by a legendary pirate captain, he expects paperwork, not ghosts. He expects ruins, not memory. But from the moment his horse sets hoof on that wind-scoured shore, something ancient begins to stir, something buried by salt storms and a truth the world chose to forget. As the sea closes in and the past refuses to stay silent, the cowboy is forced to confront a secret that was never meant to be sold, only protected. And a question he can no longer outrun: do we own the places we inherit? Or do they decide who we become? Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. Rain wasn't part of Caleb Mercer's weather vocabulary anymore. Out on ranch land, rain meant a job postponed, a fence line turned to mud, a horse that needed to be dried down before night. It didn't mean comfort. It didn't mean staying in. It didn't mean anything that lasted. He woke before dawn, the way he always did, without an alarm, without a plan, inside an empty horse trailer parked behind a barn that belonged to somebody else. The trailer smelled of old leather hay dust and the faint sour note of rust. He'd laid his bedroll along the left wall, boots lined up like a promise he didn't intend to keep. Outside, the world was pale with frost. The breath of the horses in the nearest paddock rose in small white plumes and vanished into the early light. Ash stood at the trailer door, head lowered, waiting. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of sleep and last night's wind. He reached for the worn jacket hanging from a hook and pulled it on. There were better coats in the world, warmer ones, cleaner ones. This one didn't ask questions. "Morning," he said, voice rough with disuse. Ash flicked one ear back, as if acknowledging him without turning around. Caleb stepped down onto cold gravel and walked across the yard, moving with the efficiency of a man who'd done the same motions in 100 places. Water bucket, feed, check hooves. Walk the fence line, listening for the quiet snap that meant a board had come loose. The work was simple on purpose. Simple was the only thing that didn't follow him when he left. The rancher he was working for this week, name of Bill or Ben or something that started with a B, had paid cash and asked for very little. That was the kind of deal Caleb took. The kind that let him disappear again before anyone could decide they wanted him around. He opened the gate and led Ash into the main pasture. The grass was thin, winter burned, but the horses lowered their heads and moved in slow arcs, their bodies dark against the gray morning. Ash walked beside him, shoulder near Caleb's hip, matching his pace like he'd been built for it. Caleb didn't ride much unless he had to. Riding invited thoughts. Riding made it easier to believe you were going somewhere. He leaned on the top rail of the fence and watched the herd move. He could have been anyone standing there, any hired hand, any drifter, any man with hands rough enough to hold a rope. But there were small details that set him apart. The way he scanned the horizon, even when there was nothing to scan. The way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the distant metallic clatter of a gate. Ash turned his head, nostrils widening, and Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing. Just a strip of road beyond the property line, and a sky that didn't care. Caleb rested his forehead briefly against Ash's neck. The horse was warm, steady, real. "Just one more week," Caleb murmured. "Same as always." Ash breathed out a slow, soft sound through his nose. And Caleb let himself believe for half a second that the horse understood. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed enough to thin the frost. Caleb hauled water, mended a loose hinge, dragged a fallen branch away from a fence line. The rhythm was familiar. It was the closest thing he had to a home, the repetition of tasks that ended cleanly. He avoided coastal jobs the way some men avoided certain roads at night. If a rancher mentioned a transport run that would take him near the water Seattle, the Oregon coast, down toward the Gulf, Caleb always found a reason to pass. He told people he didn't like humidity. He told them his truck didn't handle salt air well. He told them anything that sounded practical. The truth was less tidy. Sometimes on very still days, a far-off sound would travel strangely across the land, a long, mournful horn from a freight train, or the heavy clang of metal on metal from some distant workyard. In the wrong arrangement, those sounds could become something else in his head, an anchor chain dropping a ship's bell or the low groan of timbers under pressure. And then he would leave, before anyone noticed, before the body remembered how to shake. That afternoon, Bill or Ben called him over from the barn door. "Mercer," the man said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Got something for you?" Caleb paused, one hand still on the latch of the tack room. He hated surprises. He hated anything that arrived with his name on it. The rancher held up an envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, too clean for a place that smelled like hay and manure. The handwriting was neat and old-fashioned, as if the person who'd written it believed penmanship could prevent mistakes. "This came in with the rest," the rancher said. "Figured it was yours." Caleb didn't take it right away. He looked at it the way you look at a snake in tall grass, trying to decide whether it was real or a trick of light. The envelope had a faint scent to it. Paper, yes. But also something else, wax maybe, and dust. A preserved smell. A smell that belonged to a drawer no one opened. Aish stepped forward and lowered his head to the envelope. Caleb watched wary as the horse's nostrils flared. Ash didn't just sniff and move on. He stayed. His ears stood upright and his body went still in a way that had nothing to do with curiosity. Caleb's stomach tightened. "What is it?" he muttered more to Ash than anyone else. "It's just paper." Ash didn't budge. He stood so close that the rancher had to hold the envelope higher. "You want it or not?" the rancher asked, half amused. Caleb took it. The paper was surprisingly heavy in his hand, like it contained more than words. He walked away from the barn back toward the trailer and sat on the edge of the ramp. Ash followed and stood in front of him, blocking the exit, as if insisting this was something that needed doing now. Caleb stared at the sealed flap. A small imprint of wax held it shut. He slid a thumb under the edge and broke it. Inside was an official letter on heavy stationery. The header named a law office in a coastal town he didn't recognize. The language was formal and cold in that way. Legal language is when it needs to be both polite and undeniable. "We are writing to inform you of an inheritance pertaining to the estate of Captain Elias Crow, deceased. The property in question consists of an island parcel known locally as Crow's Reach and its remaining structures. You have been identified as the legal heir through a documented chain of custody and kinship." Caleb read it once, then again. The words didn't soften. Captain Elias Crow. He had never heard the name before. But the word captain struck him like a wrong note in a song. It wasn't just that it didn't fit him. It didn't fit the life he'd built, the land he'd chosen, the inland air he'd clung to like a rule. Island. That word landed harder. Caleb folded the letter with more force than necessary, as if he could crease the meaning out of it. "No," he said softly. Ash remained in place, eyes dark and steady, watching him. Caleb felt the absurd urge to argue with a horse. "It's a mistake," he told Ash. "Has to be." Ash's ears tipped forward again, and Caleb realized the horse wasn't asking for reassurance. He was waiting. The letter included a number. Caleb stared at it for a long time, then pulled out his phone and dialed before he could change his mind. The call went through after 2 rings. Thomas Reed and Associates. A man's voice said, calm and unhurried. "How may I help you?" Caleb swallowed. "I got a letter," he said. "Says you're writing about an inheritance. Captain Elias Crow." There was a brief pause on the other end, not surprise, but the quiet shift of a man pulling a file closer. "I understand this comes as a surprise," Mr. Mercer Reed said. "It usually does." "I'm not your man," Caleb said. "I don't know who that is." "You've never met Captain Crow," Reed replied, as if that were a simple fact, not a fault. "But the connection isn't through acquaintance. It's through documentation, a chain of ownership, and more unusually, through an animal line." Caleb's grip tightened on the phone. "What does that mean?" Reed's tone remained steady. "Many years ago, Captain Crow rescued a horse in a storm off the coast. The animal was brought inland after the incident. Records indicate it was transferred into private care and later bred. Your horse, Ash, is a direct descendant. The legal connection comes through a caretaker who was documented as the horse's handler and next of kin, and that line eventually leads to you." Caleb stared at Ash, whose head was lowered now, as if listening. "You're telling me a dead pirate?" Caleb couldn't get the word out without it sounding ridiculous. "Left me an island because of a horse." Reed didn't correct the pirate part. "Captain Crow left instructions," he said. "The property cannot be sold, transferred, or formally declined without a personal inspection and signature by the named heir. It's a legal requirement tied to the estate." Caleb closed his eyes. He could feel the trailer floor under him, the familiar smell of hay. He didn't want the ocean in his mind. He didn't want the strange pull in his chest that came with it. "What if I don't go?" he asked. "Then it remains in limbo," Reed said. "The taxes are currently covered by a small account set aside by the captain, but those funds aren't infinite. Eventually, the county will intervene, and Mr. Mercer, there are already interests in that area." "Interests," Caleb repeated flatly. "Development," Reed clarified. "Investors. They've been watching that property for years. Captain Crow refused to sell. The only thing that kept it untouched was his stubbornness and the legal mess around his estate." Caleb looked at Ash again. The horse's posture hadn't changed, but there was a tension in him that wasn't fear. It was focus, like a compass needle refusing to be moved. Caleb felt something in himself give way, not in surrender, but in the tired recognition that avoiding something doesn't stop it from existing. "I'll come," he said. The words tasted like salt, even though he was still surrounded by dust. "But I'm not staying." "Of course," Reed said with a politeness that didn't argue. "I'll email you the address and details for Harbor Point. When you arrive, ask for Evan Brooks at the marina. He'll help arrange transport." Caleb ended the call and sat there for a moment with the letter in his lap. Ash stepped closer and breathed out warm air against Caleb's face. Caleb exhaled slowly, then stood. He didn't have much to pack. He never did. A change of clothes, a knife, a small first aid kit, a battered notebook he hadn't written in for months. He didn't tell the rancher goodbye. He simply paid what he owed for feed and left before anyone could ask where he was going. Ash loaded into the trailer without hesitation. Caleb pulled onto the road and drove north and west toward the coast, with the letter folded on the passenger seat, like something alive. The farther he drove, the more the air changed. Dry land gave way to damp and then to the faint edge of salt. The sky widened. The wind carried a coldness that felt older than weather. At a roadside gas station, a metal sign clanged against its pole in the wind, and Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. The sound became for a fraction of a second, a chain dropping into water. He forced himself to breathe. He forced his eyes forward. Ash stood calm behind him, and Caleb felt an irrational gratitude for that steadiness. A horse could be afraid of storms and still stand when a man couldn't. He decided to leave. But what awaits him on the other side? Is it just an island and an old name? Or a truth that will never be revealed? Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe before we dive into the most exciting part of the story. By the time Harbor Point came into view, the light was already fading. The town sat hunched around its harbor like it had grown there out of necessity. Weathered buildings, narrow streets, nets piled in corners. Boats rocked in their slips, their hulls tapping softly against the dock. Everything smelled of fish oil and seaweed left to dry. Caleb parked near the marina and stepped out. The cold was sharper here, the kind that worked into your bones slowly. He could taste the ocean on it. Ash stamped once in the trailer a single impatient knock that sounded like a question. "I know," Caleb said under his breath. "We're here." He found a small diner near the docks, its windows fogged from warmth. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried potatoes and wet wool. A few men sat at the counter, shoulders hunched, talking in low voices. Caleb took a booth in the back, ordered coffee he didn't want, and kept his eyes on the harbor through the glass. He didn't mean to listen, but in towns like this, stories move the way wind did you felt them, whether you wanted to or not. A woman near the counter said, "Crow's Reach." "I thought nobody owned that anymore." A man snorted. "Crow owned it, and Crow didn't." Another voice, older, more certain, he didn't take what screamed, only what stayed quiet. The phrase landed like a stone. Caleb's hand paused around his cup. He waited, pretending not to care, and when the woman asked, "You mean he wasn't like the others?" the older man answered without looking up. "Crow wasn't feared because he was cruel," he said. He was feared because he remembered everything. Caleb stared at the coffee's surface where the diner's dim lights shimmered. The man continued, voice dropping. "Plenty of folks tried to buy that rock, tried to turn it into a story. But Crow wouldn't sell, not for any price. Said there were things the water didn't wash clean, and he wasn't about to let strangers make money off what he couldn't bury. Then he died there," someone else murmured. "Alone. In that stone house, staring out like he was waiting on a ship that never came." Caleb looked out at the darkening water. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for details. The less he asked, the less anyone could pull him into their version of things. Still, he couldn't stop the question that settled into him like a quiet ache. What did Captain Elias Crow keep if it wasn't gold? After dark, Caleb found Evan Brooks at the marina office, a young man with tired eyes and a practical kind of patience. Evan looked at the letter, then at Caleb, then back at the letter, as if he'd been expecting someone like this, but hadn't believed it until now. "You Mercer?" Evan asked. Caleb nodded. Evan glanced at the trailer. "And that's Ash." Caleb's head lifted sharply. "How do you know?" Evan shrugged. "Mr. Reed called ahead, said there'd be a horse, said it mattered." Caleb didn't like that. He didn't like the idea that anyone else's hands were on this story. "We go in the morning," Evan said. "Weather's decent. Tide's right." Caleb slept that night in his trailer near the marina. The ocean was close enough that he could hear it moving in the dark, an endless, quiet pressure. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling, listening to waves slap gently against pilings, and tried not to let the sound become memory. Ash shifted once, a soft scrape of hoof, and then settled. The horse didn't fear the sea the way Caleb did. Or maybe he feared it, and didn't run anyway. Before dawn, Caleb walked down to the dock and stood with his hands in his pockets while the sky lightened. The water was unusually calm, almost flat like a sheet of hammered metal. Evan arrived with a small boat, not pretty, not new, but sturdy enough. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The sea demanded a certain kind of silence. Ash loaded onto the boat with care hooves placed like deliberate decisions. Caleb watched him, surprised by the horse's steadiness. If Ash was uneasy, he hid it well. They pushed off. Harbor Point shrank behind them, its lights fading. The horizon opened. The air smelled of salt and cold iron. Caleb sat near Ash, one hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. The boat cut through the water with barely a sound. "This is Crow's Reach," Evan said after a long stretch. He pointed ahead. At first, Caleb saw only a darker shape on the water. Then it became clearer, a low island of stone in a windswept scrub rising from the sea, like a thought you couldn't shake. No trees, no gentle beach. Just rock raked by waves and a few stubborn grasses that survived out of spite. As they approached, Caleb felt something tighten in him. Not fear exactly. Something older. A sense of stepping into a place that had been waiting without hurry. They tied off at a rough dock, half-rotted, its boards slick with spray. Caleb stepped onto it and felt it shift beneath his boots. Ash followed, ears forward, gaze fixed on the island's interior. Evan stayed close to the boat. "I'll give you a few hours," he said. "If you want overnight, you'll need to tell me now. I'm not coming back after dark." Caleb looked at the island again. The sky was low and gray. The sea was too calm. "I'll see," he said. Evan nodded, not pushing. "Don't wander too close to the west cliffs. They're unstable." Caleb led Ash onto the island. The ground was hard and damp, dotted with moss. There was no clear path, but Ash moved as if he knew where he was going. Not fast, just certain. Caleb had the odd sensation that the island was listening. After a short walk inland, they saw the house. It was built of stone, low and thick-walled, perched on a rise that gave a wide view of the sea. Its windows faced the water like eyes that refused to look away. The roof was dark-weathered. The door hung straight but stiff, as if it hadn't been opened in a long time. Caleb stopped at the threshold. Ash lowered his head, sniffed the stone, and breathed out. Caleb reached for the latch. It gave under his hand with a reluctant groan. Cold air met them, carrying the smell of salt dust and old oil. Inside the room was sparse but orderly. A wooden table near the window. A chair positioned to face the sea. An oil lamp on a shelf. A kettle hanging above a small stove. Not abandoned in panic. Not ruined by neglect. Preserved. On the table lay a few sheets of paper curled at the edges. Caleb picked one up carefully, handwriting tight and precise. Weather calm, tide low, ship sighted none. He flipped to the next. Another date, another short entry. This wasn't the romantic scrawl of a legend. It was the daily record of a man who had trained himself to stay. Ash did not come inside. He stood at the door, half in shadow, half in the gray daylight, and refused to cross the threshold. Caleb looked at him. "You don't trust it either, huh?" he said quietly. Ash flicked an ear. Stayed. Caleb walked through the house slowly. There was no treasure, no ornate chest, no relics on display. Just the bones of a life. Tools hung on a pegboard, a coil of rope, a rusted compass on a shelf. He found a small box beneath the table, with more papers, journals torn from binding pages, missing words interrupted. The entries were similar tides, storms, names of ships. Sometimes a line that didn't fit with the rest. Didn't take them. Truth stays. Caleb read those words twice, then set the page down like it was hot. Outside, the sky dimmed further. The ocean remained calm, but the air had a weight to it. The kind of pressure that came before something broke. Caleb stepped back out and looked toward the west side of the island where the cliffs dropped sharply into the water. Ash turned his head in that direction too. "You know something?" Caleb murmured. Ash didn't answer, of course. He just stood there as if waiting for Caleb to catch up. Caleb made a decision without naming it. He told Evan he'd stay the night. Evan frowned. "Weather's shifting," he warned. "I'll be fine," Caleb said. "I've slept in worse." Evan looked at Ash, then back at Caleb. "Your call." When the boat left, the island went quiet in a way that felt complete. No engines, no distant voices. Just the low hush of water around Stone. Caleb lit the oil lamp inside the watch house. The flame threw soft, uneven light over the walls. He ate from a tin of beans and listened to the wind work at the seams of the building. Ash remained outside, standing near the door, like a silent guardian who refused to swear allegiance to Stone. That night, Caleb slept poorly. He woke repeatedly, not from noise, but from the feeling of being held inside a place that wasn't his. Each time he woke, he heard the sea in the distance, steady, patient. In the early hours, the wind changed. It slid along the house like a hand. Caleb sat up and listened. The air smelled sharper now. Not just salt, something like wet metal. Outside, Ash stamped once, then again, not in panic, but in insistence. Caleb pulled on his boots and stepped out into darkness. The sky was smeared with cloud, and the horizon had disappeared. The sea, invisible in the dark, sounded closer. Ash moved away from the door, head lifted, ears forward, body tense. "What is it?" Caleb asked, though he already felt the answer in his bones. The first gust hit like a shove. By morning, the storm had arrived fully. It came fast, violent, and without ceremony. The wind howled over the island, tearing spray off the sea and flinging it like needles. Waves struck the cliffs with a force that made the ground tremble. Caleb tried to keep Ash close, but the horse moved with a strange urgency, circling, pausing, looking west, then vanishing into sheets of rain before Caleb could stop him. "Ash!" Caleb shouted. The wind took the sound and broke it apart. "Stay where you are." He ran, boots slipping on wet rock, heart hammering. The world narrowed to gray water and blurred stone. He couldn't see far. He couldn't hear much beyond the roar. A cracking sound split the air. Caleb looked up in time to see a section of cliff collapse. Stone sheared away and fell into the sea like a building being demolished. The wave that followed surged higher than the rest, white and furious. Caleb's foot slid. His hand grabbed at wet rock and found nothing. For one sharp second, he understood how easy it was to vanish here. Then Ash appeared, close, solid eyes, bright with something fierce. The horse did not run toward Caleb. He turned his head, stepped away, and looked back as if saying, "Follow." Caleb didn't think. He moved. He ran after Ash through rain so thick it felt like pushing through cloth. "All right," he gasped. "I'm with you." Ash led him to a narrow cut between two large boulders, a hollow sheltered from the worst of the wind. Inside, the roar softened to a deep, constant thunder. Caleb pressed his back to the stone and sucked in air. Ash stood partly in the opening body, angled so his broad chest took the brunt of the spray. The horse shook, but he didn't move away. "You knew," Caleb whispered, half accusation, half awe. Ash's ears flicked. He stood. He endured. The storm battered the island for hours. Caleb stayed in the hollow with Ash, watching the gray blur of the world. and feeling the helplessness of being small against sea and stone. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't moving. He wasn't leaving. He was simply staying because leaving wasn't possible. When the wind finally loosened its grip, it felt less like victory than like exhaustion. The rain thinned, the clouds lifted a fraction. The sea remained wild, but its anger had steadied into a heavy rolling breath. Caleb climbed out of the hollow and looked toward the west cliffs. The storm had changed the island. Where solid stone had been, there were now raw fractures, fresh lines like wounds. A portion of the cliff face had broken away, exposing darker rock beneath. The island looked as if time itself had been split open. Ash moved immediately, walking with purpose along the new break. Caleb followed, cautious heart still thudding. The tide was lower now than Caleb had seen it since arriving. The storm had pulled water away from the shore, revealing rock shelves and crevices usually hidden. Ash stopped near a narrow seam in the stone, an opening that hadn't been there before, or if it had been sealed by rubble. Now wet and raw, it gaped like a mouth. The smell hit Caleb before he even bent down. Salt, yes, but also iron. Rust, old metal. This isn't just the sea, Caleb said softly. Ash lowered his head, nostrils flaring, and exhaled into the opening, as if greeting it. Caleb knelt and moved stones aside. The rubble shifted more easily than it should have, as if the storm had loosened it on purpose. Behind the stones, the opening widened into a low tunnel. Ash stepped forward, then stopped at the threshold. He did not go in. He simply stood there, head turned slightly toward Caleb, waiting. Caleb stared at him. "You're not coming," he said. Ash blinked. Caleb swallowed. He pulled out his flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it into the dark. The beam caught wet stone, a downward slope, and the faint glimmer of something metallic deeper inside. He took a slow breath and went in. The passage was narrow and low. He had to hunch shoulders, scraping rock. Water dripped from the ceiling. The air was cold and damp, thick with salt and the sharp tang of iron. The flashlight beam wobbled as Caleb moved, revealing walls that weren't naturally formed. There were straight lines here, edges shaped by tools. A man-made space hidden inside the island. After a short descent, the passage opened into a small chamber. Caleb stopped. There was no glitter of gold, no pile of coins, no skull and crossbones fantasy waiting in the dark. Instead, there was a simple wooden chest, darkened with age, banded with iron, and set on a stone shelf as if placed carefully. Beside it lay a rolled parchment tied with twine, and a small canvas sack that looked heavy with paper. Caleb stepped closer. The chest's lock was intact but not heavily fortified. It wasn't meant to keep thieves out forever. It was meant to keep the contents safe long enough for the right hands. He touched the lock. Cold, not corroded like everything else on the island. He pulled. It opened with a soft click that felt almost like permission. Inside, everything was wrapped in oilcloth layers, carefully folded, sealed against damp. Caleb lifted the first bundle and unrolled it. A book. Not ornate, not dramatic. Just a journal, thick, worn, its pages filled with tight handwriting. He opened it. The entries were dated. Not every day, but enough to track time. The writing was plain factual. Weather, tide, coordinates, names of ships. Then in the middle of a page, a line that made Caleb's throat tighten without warning. Didn't take them. Couldn't. Caleb turned the page. Another entry, another date, another ship name, followed by a note. We pulled them out. All of them. Children, too. His flashlight beam shook slightly. He set the journal down and unrolled the parchment. It wasn't a treasure map. It was a sea chart marked with routes. Not routes to hidden islands, but routes around storms, routes toward coves and safe passages. Marks near reefs labeled with small, careful notes. Anchor here in bad weather. Fresh water. Keep lights low, safe harbor. Someone had used this map as a tool for survival, not profit. Caleb reached for the canvas sack. Inside were letters sealed, addressed, never sent. Names written in the same precise hand. One letter was addressed to someone whose name had been crossed out so heavily it was unreadable. Another was addressed simply to whoever stays. Caleb stared at that line until the words blurred. He opened the journal again, turning pages more quickly now, hunger rising in him. Not greed, something else. The need to understand. The further he read, the more the shape of Captain Elias Crow emerged. He wasn't a myth. He was a man who recorded his days with stubborn consistency, as if writing them down prevented them from being rewritten by others. There were entries about storms that arrived early, about ships sighted, about nights spent watching the horizon. And then threaded through it all the same quiet insistence. We didn't take them. Truth stays. Caleb found an entry marked with a smear of ink, as if the writer's hand had shaken. They call me thief. It keeps their hands clean. Later, if I save them, they call it a trick. And beneath that, so I stayed. Caleb sat back on his heels, breath slow. The chamber felt smaller now, not because of stone, but because of the weight of the words. He read deeper, piecing together the story. Crow had once served as a guardian of maritime routes, someone responsible for protection, orders, safe passage. Something happened, an incident involving a ship, a powerful interest, perhaps a decision that made enemies. The journal didn't name names outright, but it hinted at betrayal with the restraint of someone who knew what power could do. He was labeled pirate, not because he took too much, but because someone needed him to be a villain. And when the world decided you were a villain, the truth became dangerous. So he hid it. Not in a bank. Not in a courtroom. In stone and salt on an island that refused to be convenient. Caleb looked down at his own hands. Hands that had held reins and fence wire and a steering wheel for too many miles. He thought of all the times he'd left places without explaining himself, letting people assume what they wanted because it was easier than arguing with their version. He thought of the sea he'd avoided the way salt air made his body remember. He didn't know in that moment whether he felt anger or grief or something else entirely. He only knew the chamber was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. He gathered the journal and the letters, not taking them out yet, just holding them as if weighing the decision. Then he climbed back up the passage shoulders, brushing stone, and emerged into gray daylight. Ash was still there, standing at the entrance, unmoving. Caleb stopped in front of him. "You brought me here," Caleb said. Ash's dark eyes held steady. Caleb exhaled a sound that might have been a laugh in another life. "You knew," he repeated softer now, "all this time." Ash turned his head away from the opening. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, simply as if the task was complete. Caleb closed the opening with the stones again, not sealing it fully, but enough to protect it from casual discovery. He led Ash back toward the watch house in silence. That night, the storm's aftertaste still hung in the air. The sea remained loud but steady. Caleb sat at the table with the journal open and read by lamplight until his eyes ached. He didn't read the entire thing at once. Some truths needed to be swallowed slowly. But the core became clear. Crow had stayed to guard evidence of what he'd done, not to prove he was good, but to prevent a lie from becoming the only story. And in that, Caleb felt an unsettling kinship. He looked up at the chair by the window, the chair Crow had likely sat in, watching the water like a man waiting for judgment. Caleb found himself whispering, "I get it now." He didn't know if he meant Crow, or himself, or the island. In the days that followed, the island shifted back toward its quieter rhythms. The sea calmed. The sky cleared in brief, pale stretches. Caleb walked the perimeter again, but now with a different awareness. He wasn't just exploring, he was being shown. Ash no longer pulled him toward the west cliffs. The horse walked normally, grazing when there was grass drinking from the small catch basin Caleb had found near the house. The urgency had left him, as if he'd done what he came to do. Caleb kept the chest hidden. He kept the journal inside the house, protected from damp. He didn't tell Evan. He didn't tell Harbor Point. He needed time. Then one afternoon, the sound of an engine approached across the water. Caleb stood outside the watch house, squinting into the glare off the sea. A sleek, white motorboat cut through the water with confidence too clean for these parts. Ash lifted his head, ears pricked, but did not tense. He watched, expression unreadable. The boat slowed near the dock, and a man stepped out, wearing a gray jacket that still held sharp creases. His shoes looked expensive, unsuited to wet boards and salt. He carried a leather briefcase like a shield. He called out before stepping farther. Mr. Mercer. Caleb didn't answer right away. He simply watched. The man smiled politely, the way people do when they believe politeness can buy cooperation. "Richard Hale," he said, holding out a hand. "I hope I'm not intruding." Caleb didn't take the hand. Hale withdrew it smoothly, not offended, just adapting. "I represent a development group that's been acquiring land around this coastline," Hale said. His eyes traveled over the watch house, the broken dock, the rough stone. Crow's Reach has potential. Caleb's jaw tightened. Potential for what? Hale chuckled lightly. For becoming something people can access, experience, history. There's a growing market for authentic coastal retreats, heritage sites, curated stories. People pay good money to touch the past. Caleb's gaze stayed on Hale's face. "Touch it," he echoed. Hale's smile didn't falter. "Of course," respectfully. "We'd preserve the structure, restore it, make it safe. Add a small visitor lodge, interpretive signage, guided tours. The pirate captain's last stand," something along those lines. He said it as if naming a product, not a human life. Ash took one step closer to Caleb. Not aggressive, just present. Hale noticed the movement and glanced at the horse, then back to Caleb. "Must be difficult living out here with only an animal for company," he said, tone sympathetic in a manufactured way. "Think of what you could do with the money. A proper ranch inland, stable income, security." Caleb listened without interrupting. The wind moved over the island, carrying the scent of the sea. Somewhere above, a gull cried a thin, sharp sound that felt like laughter without joy. Hale leaned slightly forward, sensing he had room. "People don't come for truth, Mr. Mercer," he said gently. "They come for a story they can recognize." Caleb felt the words land with a clean bluntness. He thought of the journal in the watch house, of Crow's tight handwriting, of the stubborn refusal to let the world write over what happened. He met Hale's eyes. "You want to sell a version?" he said. Hale spread his hands. "We want to keep the place from rotting away. It's a win for everyone. You walk away, compensated, the public gains access, and Crow's legend, whatever it is, gets preserved." Caleb's voice stayed quiet. "Legend isn't the same as memory." Hale's smile tightened slightly. "Memory doesn't pay taxes." Caleb looked out at the water. The sea was calm today, innocent looking, as if it hadn't tried to kill him days earlier. That was the ocean's cruelty. It didn't wear its danger on the surface. He turned back. "Some places don't survive being explained," Caleb said. Hale blinked. "Excuse me?" Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. You can't buy what the island keeps, he said, and you can't sell what you don't understand. Hale's expression hardened a fraction. I understand this is new to you, but you have to consider practicality. Winter will be brutal. Maintenance, supplies, isolation. What happens when the weather turns and no one's watching? Caleb felt Ash's warm breath near his shoulder. The horse stood steady, unbothered. Caleb answered honestly. Then I'll deal with it, he said. Hale studied him. For the first time, his politeness slipped enough to show impatience beneath. We can make a generous offer, he said. Enough to set you up for life. Caleb thought of all the times he'd moved on because it was easier than staying. All the times he'd let people assume whatever kept them comfortable. He thought of Crow riding in the dark, knowing the truth might never matter. Caleb shook his head once. No. Hale's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake. Caleb didn't argue. He only said, I'm making a choice. For a long moment, Hale stood very still, as if recalibrating. Then he nodded stiffly. If you change your mind, you know how to reach me. He walked back to his boat, stepping carefully on the slick boards, and left without looking back. When the engine faded, the island's silence returned. It felt deeper now, as if the place itself had exhaled. Caleb remained where he was for a while, watching the water settle. Ash lowered his head and grazed at a small patch of grass, calm as if the interruption had been nothing. That evening, Caleb made a decision he'd been circling since he opened the chest. He wasn't going to let Hale or anyone turn Crow's life into a theme. But he also wasn't going to let Crow's truth die in stone. He took the journal and carefully copied sections by hand into his notebook, dates, coordinates, the entries that mattered. He copied the map markings. He copied the letter addressed to whoever stays word for word, with the same restraint Crow had used. Then, when his notes were complete, he sealed the copied pages in an envelope and addressed it to a maritime museum in the nearest city. Not a tabloid, not a tourist board, an institution that would treat the material as history, not entertainment. He kept the original journal and letters on the island, returned to the chest, wrapped again in oilcloth. He carried the chest back down the salt passage and placed it exactly where he'd found it. He closed the stones over the entrance with care, leaving no obvious sign. When he emerged, Ash was waiting. The horse didn't look toward the passage at all. He simply stood, ears relaxed, body loose. Caleb touched Ash's neck. It's done, he said softly. The next weeks moved like slow water. Caleb began repairing the watch house, not to restore it into something new, but to keep it from failing. He reseated stones in the wall where the storm had loosened them. He patched the roof with scavenged boards from the old dock. He cleaned the windows so the sea could be seen clearly again. He worked when the weather allowed. He rested when it didn't. He stopped measuring time by departure. Ash moved with the ease of a horse that had returned to the most basic truth: eat, drink, stand, sleep, follow the sun. Birds came back, not in flocks at first, just one, then two, then more. Gulls circled and cried. At dusk, Caleb sometimes saw a dark shape far out on the water, maybe a whale, maybe just a trick of light. He didn't chase it. He let it be. The island softened around him, not in temperature, but in presence. One night, Caleb sat in Crow's chair by the window oil lamp, low, and wrote in his notebook. He wrote the date, the tide, the wind direction, the repair he'd finished that day. He didn't write to impress anyone. He wrote the way you stack firewood one piece at a time, building something that might last. He found himself writing a line he hadn't intended stayed. He stared at it for a long time, then didn't cross it out. In the mornings, he walked the shore with Ash, letting the horse pick his own pace. The west cliffs remained scarred from the storm, raw edges bright against dark stone. Caleb didn't go down to the salt passage. Neither did Ash. The secret had moved into a quieter category, no longer a discovery, but a responsibility. One cold day, a small package arrived on the next supply run Evan brought. It was a letter from the Maritime Museum, brief but formal. They confirmed receipt. They expressed interest. They asked for a follow-up interview, more documentation permission to send an archivist. Caleb read it twice, then folded it and set it beside the lamp. He didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure yet how much of Crow's truth belonged to the world. But he knew it didn't belong to Richard Hale. As autumn crept in, the wind sharpened. The sea turned darker. The island's grasses yellowed. Caleb reinforced the roof again. He stacked driftwood near the stove. He made small adjustments that would have felt pointless months earlier when he'd believed he was only passing through. At night, when the wind pressed against the watch house, Caleb would wake and listen not in fear, but in attentiveness. The island's noises were becoming familiar. The sea had different moods, different tones. He learned to recognize them the way you learn the voice of someone you live with. One morning, the sky was clear in a rare pale way, washed clean after a night of wind. The ocean lay smooth, almost glassy, reflecting weak sunlight, like a mirror that didn't want to reveal too much. Caleb stepped outside with a mug of coffee and stood on the threshold. Ash was already there, looking out at the horizon. Caleb followed the horse's gaze. There was nothing dramatic to see, no ship rising from fog, no sign from the past. Just water meeting sky, endless and ordinary, and quietly vast. Caleb realized with a kind of surprise that felt like relief that he wasn't waiting for anything. He wasn't waiting to leave. He wasn't waiting for the story to finish. He was simply there in the middle of the day with a horse and a house and a piece of land that had once been held by a man who refused to let truth be sold. Caleb stepped closer to Ash and rested his hand on the horse's shoulder. "I didn't inherit you," he said quietly. Not sure who he was speaking to, Ash Crow or the island itself. "I just ended up with you." Ash shifted his weight, calm, present. The horse lowered his head and tapped a hoof once against stone, an ordinary sound, a small punctuation. The island answered with silence, deep and steady, not empty. And in that silence, Caleb understood the difference between ownership and belonging. He hadn't come to claim anything. He had come because the island, through storms, through salt, through a horse's stubborn memory, had made space for him to stay. Caleb stayed where he was a while longer, long enough for the quiet to stop feeling like a pause and start feeling like a condition. The kind you adapted to, not the kind you waited out. The island did not ask him to be anything. It did not reward him for staying. It did not soften its edges or promise gentler weather. It simply continued stone holding against water wind, moving where it always had. That he realized was the difference between mercy and indifference. Mercy wanted something back. Indifference let you decide who you were, without interference. He thought about the museum letter again, not with urgency now, but with distance. There would be conversations eventually, careful ones, words chosen like tools, not offerings. He would decide what could be carried away, and what needed to remain anchored here, untranslatable, except by standing in the same wind, smelling the same salt, listening long enough for the island to answer in its own time. Crow had stayed to keep a truth from being rewritten. Caleb understood now that staying wasn't a single act, it was a practice. Something you recommitted to every morning you woke up and chose not to leave just because leaving was easier. He wondered how many men before him had passed this place without seeing it. How many had looked at the rock and thought only of shelter or danger or profit. How few had thought of it as a witness. Ash shifted beside him, hooves scraping softly against stone. Caleb glanced down and smiled despite himself. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." The horizon remained empty. No ship approached, no sign rose out of the water. The world did not mark the moment. And somehow that felt right. Caleb turned back toward the watch house at last. Not with a sense of returning to something temporary, but with the unremarkable certainty of someone walking toward where they would sleep. Tomorrow would bring weather and work and choices that would not announce themselves as important. He went anyway. Behind him, the watch house held its shape against the wind. The stones were cold, but solid. The chair still faced the sea. The lamp waited on the shelf. The island had once kept a secret long enough for it to reach the right hands. Now it kept something else, the slow, unremarkable continuation of a life that had finally stopped running. Caleb stood there until the coffee cooled. He didn't move, not because he was trapped, but because for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to go anywhere else. Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered all at once. They wait, buried beneath salt silence and time, until someone finally listens. If this story stayed with you, thank you for walking these quiet shores with us to the very end. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you felt the weight of this island, a like and a subscribe help us share many more stories like it.